Chapter 5. Our flotilla had come up and was moored before Giza. The ammunition consumed was replaced by a fresh supply, and we were ready to commence fresh operations when called upon. The authorities of Cairo, the heads of the law and magistrates, came to Giza to offer their submission to General Bonaparte, who gained their confidence and drew such information from them as fixed his determination with respect to ulterior operations. His first object was to secure military occupation of Egypt. He immediately ordered Regnier's division to pursue Ibrahim in his flight. Vile's division was sent to Damietta and Dugua's to Rosetta. Bone's division protected Cairo. That of Desai, which was destined to proceed to Upper Egypt, waited at Giza until the others had reached their respective destinations. This dispersion of the army was a signal for an explosion of that discontent and murmuring, which in consequence of the severe privations endured by the soldiers had been fomenting. Ever since we left Alexandria, they no longer hesitated to give vent to their complaints. The most moderate were sending in their resignations from all quarters. And had it not been for the firm resolution proclaimed by General Bonaparte of making an example of the very first who should presume to ask him to take the army back to France, an intention actually entertained by some of the malcontents, no doubt the army would have mutinied and refused obedience. The firmness of their chief kept them within bounds and preserved these misguided men from the disgrace that awaited them. So great was General Bonaparte's self-confidence that in this state of affairs he departed from Cairo, followed by what little cavalry he had brought from Europe, and took the road upon which Regnier's division was marching in order to drive Ibrahim back into Syria and close the entrance to Egypt in that direction. He gave the command of Cairo to General Desai, whilst he was personally engaged on this expedition, but previously to his departure, he had dispatched his aide-de-camp Julien to Admiral Brie with orders to set sail for Corfu or Toulon, and the aide-de-camp was not to return until he had seen the fleet underway. He had also sent to Mured Bey as a negotiator for peace Monsieur Rossetti, the Venetian consul, who was settled at Cairo. But such was the ignorance of these Oriental chiefs that Mured rejected General Bonaparte's proposals because he had just learned the destruction of our squadron and had persuaded himself that this event would compel us to quit Egypt. During the time that General Desai held the command, we went to visit the citadel of Cairo, situated between the town and the chain of Montquetam, which separates the Nile from the Red Sea. This fort is extremely steep in the direction of the desert and is, generally speaking, in good condition, but has no exterior works connected with it. We were here shown a breach at an elevation of upwards of 50 feet towards Montquetam, and we were told that after the Battle of the Pyramids, the Mamelukes had retired into the citadel, seeing Cairo occupied by our troops and not daring to venture out into the town, formed a resolution of escaping through that breach in order to effect the object. They began by throwing from the rampart all the mattresses and cushions of the divan and every bale of cotton they could procure. They afterwards made one of their number jump down in order to arrange these as a platform below the breach, and then followed one after another with their horses, which they actually rode on the occasion, and wonderful to say, escaped unhurt. I was shown the materials of the platform at the foot of the breach. We were also shown the collection preserved in the citadel of cuirasses and helmets formerly taken from the Crusaders. They were displayed as trophies above the entrance gate, and the interior of the citadel, the major part, were in excellent condition, although they had been exposed to the open air for ages. But the climate in those countries possesses the property of preserving objects. The well up the citadel of Cairo also attracted our curiosity. Its water is level with the Nile, and although it is of a brackish taste, no means have been neglected to procure an abundant supply. There had been constructed in the interior of the well a spiral staircase of gentle descent to the water's edge. The well is therefore of prodigious dimensions. These noble works attested the progress of arts in Egypt in former times, and they were still in good condition. We also went to visit the pyramids. No troops had ever been there before. Everyone wished to accompany General Desai, so that our party exceeded 100 persons, independently of a company of infantry, which we had taken with us as an escort. Starting from Giza, we crossed the plain where the celebrated Memphis is said to have formerly stood. Of all the ancient Egyptian cities, it is almost the only one of which no vestige remains to point out where it had existed. And if we had not met now and then in the plain below the pyramids with some broken clay at our feet, nothing would have led us to suppose it, even a wall, still as a town, had stood on the spot. Our conjectures were guided in the first place by the canal that borders the desert at the foot of the pyramids, which is at the present day without water, except at the time of the highest swellings of the Nile, and secondly by a bridge of masonry work which could only have belonged to Memphis, as otherwise it would be without an object. It must have been constructed as a means of communication of the inhabitants of Memphis with their cemetery of the dead, still to be seen by the side of the pyramids, which were nothing more than tombs. The city of the dead near Memphis consists of a countless number of small pyramids of sizes proportioned to the fortunes of families, many of which pyramids are still standing upon their bases. I had heard it stated that the large pyramids were temples, an opinion founded upon the facts of the existence of similar ones in India, where they were consecrated to religious worship, and of the Egyptians having derived their knowledge from the East. I cannot, however, join in this opinion, for the pyramids of Egypt were unquestionably tombs. I was one of the first to ascend the largest. We were to the number of 16 on the top, and yet found plenty of space. The view which is embraced from this elevation in the air is truly delightful. General Bonaparte was absent about 12 days. We witnessed at Cairo during this time the spectacle of the Feast of Ramadan, which is very rigidly observed in the East. It is their Lent. The fasting consists in neither eating nor drinking anything whatever from sunrise till sunset. The people must work, notwithstanding the excessive heat, and without attempting to quench their thirst. But the sun has no sooner disappeared from the horizon than they partake of a plentiful repast served up beforehand. Everything was new to us, but what mostly astonished our soldiers was the dancing of the Almaids, a troop of young girls remarkable for their elegance and graceful turn of figure, but of a lascivious freedom of action which must be seen to be credited, and which decency forbids me to describe. All this, however, was going on in the public square in presence of a crowd of all ages and of both sexes. We received one night intelligence of General Bonaparte's movements. He had overtaken Ibrahim in the vicinity of Salahiyeh at the entrance of the desert, to which he was endeavoring to retire, and ordered him to be charged by the cavalry, which, being too weak in numbers, incurred a very great danger, and the action would have terminated fatally had not the infantry promptly come up to relieve it. Nevertheless, the object contemplated was attained. Ibrahim entered Syria and ceased to molest us. General Bonaparte was returning to Cairo when he met on the road the officer sent from Rosetta to General Desaix, by whom he had been ordered to proceed to Salahiyeh with the intelligence of the sad catastrophe that had befallen our squadrons, of which he had been an eyewitness. I have already said that General Bonaparte, before leaving the squadron, had ordered the admiral to enter Alexandria or proceed to Corfu, but whether owing to the entrances into the harbor not having yet been sounded, or not containing a sufficiency of water, our admiral had gone to take up his moorings at the point of Aboukir, where he remained nearly a whole month. So great was General Bonaparte's uneasiness that during his march from Alexandria to Cairo, he had not only twice written to Admiral Brie to enter Alexandria or set sail for Corfu, but also, before quitting Cairo, to overtake and engage Ibrahim Bey. He had sent Julien, his aide-de-camp, to repeat the order to the admiral. But this aide-de-camp, who had embarked in a boat on the Nile with an escort of infantry, never reached his destination, nor would it have been possible for him to have done so before the squadron was engaged. He disappeared with the whole of his escort at a village on the banks of the Nile, where he had landed to purchase some provisions he stood in need of, and it was not till a long time afterwards that we learned the details of his tragical end. Our admiral had brought his squadron to anchor in a single line, his headmost ship being close to a small island forming the neck of land upon which the fort of Aboukir is built. The English, after reconnoitering it, caused 2 of their ships to pass between the small island and the headmost ship of our line. The first English ship that attempted this passage came too near the island and ran aground. The next passed between her consort, which had grounded, and the head of our line. The English admiral, finding that the first ship had grounded and the second had succeeded in forcing a passage, sent a third ship to replace the disabled one. These 2 ships, having joined, sailed up our line with the land on their right and attacked each of our ships in succession, whilst the remainder of the English squadron engaged them by sailing up our line on the other tack, a maneuver that compelled our vessels to fight on the larboard and starboard side at one and the same time. Ship after ship of our squadron was destroyed, excepting the 2 last, which, together with a frigate being at anchor at the tail of the ships at their moorings, weighed and stood out to sea without waiting to take their turn in the conflict. These were the generals and Guillaume Tell with the frigate Diane or La Justice. They proceeded to the archipelago, where they again separated. The generals went to Corfu, and the other 2 succeeded in entering Malta, a proof that the order previously given by General Bonaparte might have been carried into effect. The admiral's ship, L'Orient, caught fire and blew up during the engagement, so that out of 15 sail of the line, only 2 above mentioned succeeded in effecting their escape. The projects of General Bonaparte were necessarily affected by the defeat of this squadron, since it was to have returned to Europe for a further supply of troops, which he could now no longer reckon upon. The extent of our misfortune was not, however, so great as we had at first apprehended. Egypt was little known at this time, and the English were under the impression that we must all inevitably perish from want in that country. They were the more confirmed in their opinion by the capture of a small vessel on its way from Rosetta to Alexandria, with mail containing the first letters written to France by the army subsequently to its landing, and replete therefore with complaints of all the privations it had undergone on the march through the desert until its arrival at Cairo, during which march hardly any bread had been procured. These details served to confirm the English in their first opinion, and it occurred to them that they would greatly augment our embarrassment to increase the number of mouths we should have to feed. They accordingly landed at Alexandria. All the sailors, shipboys, and soldiers of the ships they had captured furnished us by this means with a supply of 7,000 or 8,000 men, upon which we never could have calculated. They served to complete the different corps, but above all, we derived invaluable assistance from the many artificers of all trade that were on board our ships. They were added to those brought over with the army and attached to the various scientific bodies, so that in this respect, and with regard to the artillery, we more than doubled our means of resources. It will now be seen with what admirable wisdom everything was rendered available. The loss of the fleet had in some measure calmed the murmurs of those who desired to be taken back to France. General Bonaparte ordered passports to be delivered to all who had persisted in claiming them, but with the exception of a few individuals who shall remain nameless, all determined to remain and cease making complaints. Works of a gigantic nature and establishments of every kind illustrated the first months of our residence in Egypt. The commission of scientific men had been removed from Alexandria to Cairo, and each of its members was named chief of some establishment of which he was entrusted with the formation or the management. Flour, as fine as could be obtained in Paris, was ground in mills constructed at Alexandria, Rosetta, Damietta, and Cairo. By the erection of ovens, bread became as abundant as we had hitherto found it scarce. Hospitals were formed which admitted of a bed for each patient. These benevolent establishments were powerfully promoted by the exertions of Messieurs Larry and Degenet, men possessing many claims to celebrity, and who acquired the esteem of the commander-in-chief and the gratitude of the army. Saltpeter works and powder mills were erected. A foundry was constructed with reverberating furnaces, by means of which projectiles of large dimensions were recast, and many others were provided in order to cast smaller ones for the use of our artillery. Large shops were built for locksmiths, armorers, joiners, cartwrights, carpenters, and rope makers. The sailors who were too far advanced in years to change their profession were employed in the formation of a large flotilla upon the Nile, consisting of all kinds of vessels on the river, which had been properly rigged and armed. They were commanded by officers of the Navy and were of the greatest assistance in transporting the supplies of the army. All the troops were dressed in blue cotton clothes and black morocco caps. To these were added substantial cloaks of the flannel stuff of the country to serve as a night covering. At no period had they been so comfortably equipped. The fare consisted of excellent bread, meat, rice, peas, and a little coffee and sugar as a substitute for spirits, which were unknown in Egypt until our arrival. The success of these several improvements was already manifest to all. We provided ourselves with tables, chairs, morocco leather, boots, and linen. The bread we ate was as fine as any in Paris. We had no sooner procured the objects of primary necessity than luxury followed. Plate was manufactured of a light and portable kind. The plate called hunting plate, which the emperor had afterwards in use at Paris, was made from the model of what he brought back from Egypt. Silver goblets and services of plate were now in general use. Establishments of confectioners and distillers were opened and proved very successful. Embroiderers and lace makers gradually followed. The Turks themselves, who are very quick at imitating, surpassed us in this line of business. They even succeeded in casting silver buttons stamped with the Republican arms and finishing gold ones in the greatest perfection. Playing cards, billiards, and card tables were seen in Cairo a few months after we had settled into that city. A French and Arabic printing press was at work. Everything requisite to constitute a regular European establishment was either completed or in progress. The cavalry was recruiting itself. All went on to our satisfaction and with inconceivable activity. Chapter 6. The waters of the Nile had reached their greatest height when General Bonaparte arrived at Cairo. On his return from the pursuit of Ibrahim Bey, he then ordered the departure of Desaix's division for the twofold purpose of occupying Upper Egypt and fighting Murad Bey, who had fled thither. This division consisted of 8 battalions, only one of them, since its arrival at Cairo, having been sent to garrison Alexandria. The whole division was embarked at Bulak on board of Djerm's vessels, which navigate the Nile. It was provided with only 2 pieces of artillery and ascended the Nile without stopping as far as Siout, the capital of Upper Egypt. The whole country was inundated by the overflowing of the river, and the towns and villages, which are built upon artificial elevations of ground, had become so many small islands. General Desaix learned at Siout that Murad Bey had again penetrated into the country along the borders of the desert on the left bank, leaving the inundation on his right, and contemplating to approach Cairo. He had been informed of the preparations making for an insurrection against the French and was anxious to take advantage of it, as the inundation compelled him to pass through Fayoum, so as to secure at any time his retreat into the desert, and his march was retarded by the camels loaded with provisions which followed in his train. General Desaix formed the plan of overtaking him. The decrease of the Nile had commenced when he caused his fleet of Djerms to descend as far as the entrance of Joseph's Canal, which is 4 or 5 leagues below Siout, between the Minya and Meloui. He made all his vessels enter one after the other into the canal, which is everywhere 10 or 12 toises broad, and in its whole length runs parallel to the Nile along the borders of the desert. The current of water in the canal brought the whole fleet close to Sediman, a small village standing on the edge of the desert and one of the banks of the canal. We desiree the cried the Mamelukes who fled into the desert on our approach. General Desaix, however, proceeded no farther on the canal, but landed the troops as well as the 2 pieces of artillery, and we advanced towards the desert in a compact square, offering battle to the Mamelukes, who, however, refused it. The sufferings from thirst and the approach of night made us retire to the banks of the inundated land where we had left our boats and all our provisions. The Mamelukes followed and bivouacked at a distance of 200 paces from us, so that we were obliged to take rest without breaking our square, each soldier holding his musket between his knees. The merit of French troops in circumstances of difficulty can be appreciated by those only who have lived amongst them. On the present occasion, each soldier was so impressed with the reality of the danger that he had not to be put upon his guard. The exercise of discipline was wholly uncalled for. So satisfied was he of the necessity of obedience, the troops would, of their own accord, have punished anyone amongst them guilty of a neglect calculated to compromise the safety of all. At daybreak, that is to say, at 2 or 3 o'clock in the next morning, all the troops were under arms without being called to it by the beat of drums. The boats were immediately set afloat to spare us the trouble of protecting them. We formed into 3 squares, a large one flanked by 2 smaller ones, and advanced towards the desert. Our 2 pieces of artillery were stationed at the 2 angles of our front and could be removed to the angles in the rear by penetrating through the interior of the square. We were ascending in this order one of the hills of the desert to take possession of its summit and command a greater extent of country, when, without receiving any other notice on the approach of the Mamelukes than the noise of their tam-tam and the cloud of dust which they raised in their advance, our squares were suddenly charged by a swarm of this impetuous cavalry, and with such desperate fury that the right was broken and lost 15 or 20 men by the fault of its commander. This officer, who was a man of undoubted courage, had formed the plan of reserving his fire until its sure aim could be taken. He tried the experiment. It happened, however, that the horses of the Mamelukes, though pierced with shot, forced their way through the square and dropped at 100 paces beyond it, so that they made openings in their ranks, into which the Mamelukes who were behind did not fail to penetrate. General Desaix severely reprimanded this officer, who, with the best intentions, committed an error which was likely for a few moments to be attended with serious consequences. We had but just time to halt, point our artillery, and commence a firing in double files, which for the space of half an hour prevented our distinguishing any object, owing to the smoke, dust, and confusion. The action very opportunely for us ceased with the firing, as we had only 9 cannon shot left, and our cartridges were nearly exhausted. The conflict had been very disastrous to the Mamelukes, who fled in all directions. The ground was cleared before us in a very few minutes, and we continued to ascend the hill, from the summit of which the beautiful and richly cultivated province of Fayoum presented itself to our view. We retraced our steps down the hill in order to be in communication with our boats, which had witnessed the late encounter from the midst of the inundated lands. They followed our movement and came up with us at the small village of Sedaman, where we passed the night. Our departure the next morning was rather accelerated by the decrease of the waters, as it hardly allowed our boats sufficient time to reach the lower entrance of the canal through which we were to return to the Nile. We therefore quitted Sedaman at daybreak and took up a position at the entrance of the province of Fayoum, a distance of only 1 league from the village. Just as canal runs in front of the neck of land that unites this province to the valley of the Nile, during the heaviest inundations, the canal discharges its superabundant waters into another canal, which branches off from the first at the village of Ileon and carries them to the town of Fayoué and thence to Lake Maurice. The bed of this canal is lower than that of Joseph's Canal. At their point of junction, there is a dike of separation in work of solid masonry, surmounted with a stone bridge of very great antiquity. We crossed it for the purpose of fixing ourselves at the entrance to the province towards which we were marching. General Desaix, having landed everything belonging to his division, sent the boats back to the Nile and bivouacked his troops in a wood of date trees, quite impenetrable to the sun's rays, and on the borders of the canal of Ileon. We remained some days in this position where we had everything in abundance. The canal was deep enough to admit of our bathing in it. Exhausted as we were by oppressive heat, after marching through the desert for 7 or 8 successive days, we indulged without restraint in the delightful enjoyment of these baths. The abuse of them was productive of pernicious consequences to us. 48 hours afterwards, 800 of our men were attacked with ophthalmia in so severe a manner as to become entirely blind. General Desaix himself was of the number and experienced the most acute sufferings. Our situation alarmed us to such a degree that we immediately made arrangements for proceeding to Faué, where we expected to find some relief for our numerous sick. We placed General Desaix with some soldiers in a small boat, which descended the canal whilst the column followed the road leading to Faué along its bank. The soldiers suffering from blindness exceeded in number those in health. Each soldier, having the use of his sight, or only attacked in one eye, led several of his blind comrades, who nevertheless carried their own arms and baggage. We bore a much greater resemblance to men discharged from an hospital than to a warlike body. After penetrating for several hours through fields in an admirable state of cultivation and covered with rose trees in full bloom, we arrived at Faué in the wretched condition I have described. The town is of considerable size, the capital Faué, and situated in the heart of that province, which presents to the eye a uniform sheet of verdure. Its only communication with Egypt is by a neck of land, of which Ilaon is the extreme point. The canal of Ilaon runs through the province and the capital, whence it branches out into a multitude of irrigating streams that fertilize the surrounding country in their course towards Lake Maurice, into which they discharge their superfluous waters. This province enjoys a greater degree of tranquility than any part of Egypt, with which country it has very little intercourse. Over the canal running through the town is a bridge of great antiquity and resembling those I had seen in Egypt. They appeared to be of kindred origin. I do not think they exceeded 5 in number. One of them thrown over the canal running at the bases of the pyramid, and no doubt connected with Memphis in former days, another at Ilaon, and a third at Faué, and the remaining 2 at Siot. We stayed at Faué until the disappearance of the waters, an occurrence soon followed by the drying up of the country, or rather by the adherence of ground which is necessary for sowing, an operation simply consisting in throwing the seed over the mud and embedding it by means of men who tread over the fields in every direction. The ground is never plowed except when it has become too hard to admit of being sown in the manner I have just described. At no period since our arrival in Egypt have we enjoyed so much comfort as during our stay in Faué. We remained there upwards of a month, at the end of which all our sufferers from ophthalmia had recovered. Ovens were erected and the military administration of the provinces was organized. We were soon prepared to resume our march and proceeded across the beautiful and verdant fields of a country which was about to display to our sight its wonderful and unexpected fecundity. General Bonaparte had signified to General Desaix his satisfaction at the conduct of his division and instructed him to levy money and horses in the province of Faué. This order was punctually carried into effect and afforded us the opportunity of visiting the famous Lake Maurice, which received the waters of the canal that form a junction with Joseph's Canal at the village of Ilaon. Those travelers must have been greatly mistaken who had pretended that this lake was formed as a reservoir for the overflowing waters of the Nile, which it afterwards discharged over the country during the drought. This opinion is probably maintained by people who have not had the advantage of personal knowledge. We certainly discovered near Ilaon, on the right bank of the canal and of the road leading to Faué, a very spacious basin constructed of masonry, which was then full of water. It may be 200 feet long and of equal breadth. It is also more elevated than the surrounding land. It can only be filled by the waters of the Nile when at its greatest rise, or by means of a small floodgate, which were open for the double purpose of admitting the water or of letting it out. They still answer the same purpose. This basin, however, cannot be the one alluded to by travelers. There is hardly a single mill in Europe, the pond of which does not hold a greater volume of water, and the whole contents of the basin would hardly be sufficient to irrigate a few acres of land. It cannot therefore be the celebrated Lake Maurice, or the exaggeration of historians must have exceeded all bounds. I had the command of the first detachment of light infantry sent from Fowey to overrun the province. My attention was particularly attracted to the remains which it exhibited of its ancient state of civilization and to the system of irrigation which prevailed in as great perfection as in Italy. A multitude of little canals branch out in all directions from the town of Fowey to carry their waters into every village of the province. Each village has its canal and keeps it in proper repair. When a village has excited displeasure, the floodgate of its canal is closed, and it is deprived of water until the orders signified to it have been complied with. No other means of coercion can be productive of so prompt and effectual a result. The government of the provinces requires only the aid of one man to open or close the floodgates. I believe I was the first person in the army who visited Lake Moeris, and this imposing sight convinced me that the canal of Fayoum formerly ran through the mound of sand which the winds had collected in heaps at the extremity of the lake, and that its waters discharged themselves into the Mediterranean through Lake Merotis in the vicinity of Alexandria. The winds constantly prevailing in that quarter have by degrees driven these sandhills into the canal and completely choked up the part beyond them, which is called at the present day the Waterless River, in which the inhabitants assured me that fragments of petrified boats were still to be seen. As the waters carried every year to this spot by the rising of the Nile found no longer any outlet, they must necessarily have overflowed and formed an immense sewer, which has gone on constantly increasing, but which, being in the lowest ground in the province, could never lose its waters by other means than evaporation under the burning sun of this climate. I do not think that the existence of Lake Moeris can be accounted for in any other manner. There is a small island about the center of the lake upon which the inhabitants of the town of Fowey, the Arsinoe of antiquity, constructed their city of the dead and erected a temple which is still in existence. Every opulent family had its tomb in it, with a sepulchral recess for each of its members. In those days, as at the present time, it was an object of constant occupation with the Egyptians to provide for their last home. The city of the dead had accordingly become as extensive as that of the living, and the dwellings were more or less alike in both. The city of the dead could only be approached in a boat, and in all likelihood, the boatman, who was at the same time the guardian of the tombs, went by the name of Charon. Since the inhabitants of the province still give to Lake Moeris the appellation of Birk el Caron, the Lake of Caron. The funeral of the higher classes was attended with great pomp. The inferior ranks were buried with less display, and the family of the deceased, after embalming the body, carried it to a spot destined for the purpose on the border of the lake near the place of embarkation, whence Charon removed it to his boat and transported it across to the tomb appropriated for its destination. The boatman waited until several bodies had been brought down by the respective families, who never failed to place on each corpse the name of the deceased and the piece of coin which accrued to Charon as his perquisites. Each family afterwards proceeded to their respective tombs on an appointed day and rendered the last duties to their deceased relatives. The poor, who neither possessed a tomb nor the means of being embalmed, were no doubt carried to the border of the lake by their relatives, who placed on their tongues the piece of coin claimed by Charon as his due previously to burying them. Nearly the same practice is still prevalent in Egypt and all towns of sufficient extent to possess a city of tombs. The Egyptians have still the habit of hiding their money under the tongue. It appeared very extraordinary to us on our first arrival that a Turk, before he handed us any change, would spit out all the middens which he kept concealed in his mouth, sometimes to the number of 150 or 200, without either his voice or his powers of eating and drinking being at all affected by it. An event occurred during our stay at Fowey which compelled us to resume our march with the soldiers who had but just recovered from the ophthalmia. Murad Bey, who had been informed of the plan of an insurrection contemplated at Cairo, had approached that city, which had in reality been the scene of a seditious movement. The populace, urged on by the influential inhabitants and the sheiks, had repaired from the different residences of the base where we had placed some of our establishments. A few assassinations took place in the streets, but the insurrection was so ill-directed as to afford the garrison time to run to arms and proceed to the several points threatened with an attack. A prompt and severe example was made of the first who were taken in the act, and the agitation was soon appeased. The leaders sued for pardon, and it was granted them under a condition of heavy contribution, which we were not sorry to have an opportunity of imposing upon them. On being informed of this result, Murad Bey had again retreated into Upper Egypt along the border of the desert and reached the extremity of the province of Fayoum, where he endeavored to raise an insurrection against us. We quitted Fayoum with the intentions of encountering him or driving him back, leaving our sick and the rest of our blind soldiers in the house, which the government had deserted on our arrival, and of which we barricaded the entrance. This house had terraces commanding the approaches to it and contained our stores of ammunition and provisions. We had scarcely reached the distance of a few leagues from the town when the Mamelukes were in pursuit of escaped our vigilance and rushed into the town, hoping to excite the inhabitants to an attack upon the house in which our soldiers were quartered. Having failed, however, in this object, they made the attempt themselves and prepared to scale the walls. The sick instantly rushed out of their beds. Those affected with ophthalmia threw the bandages from their eyes. All flew to arms and ascended the terraces of the house, and by the fire of their musketry succeeded in driving away the assailants and compelling them to relinquish the attempt. Murad Bey retreated through the town into the desert in a direction opposite to the one in which he had first made his appearance, and withdrew a second time to Upper Egypt. The intelligence of this event was communicated to General Dessay by an inhabitant of Fayoum, who had been dispatched to him by the commander of the soldiers he had left in the town. He retraced his steps and was well pleased to find that an attack which might have been attended with fatal consequences had not cost a single life. In our last excursion, we met with a large quagmire of considerable dimensions, since it extended the whole length of the province, from its opening towards Egypt as far as Lake Muris, and was as broad as one of the first rivers in Europe. This quagmire seems to have been one of the receptacles for the waters of the Nile, a circumstance tending to confirm the opinion I have expressed respecting the formation of Lake Moeris and the waterless river. It is far too deep and spacious to be a work of human construction. The bottom of it still presents a stream bordered by a very high rushes, and we were told by the inhabitants that this muddy stream was supplied with water all the year round. We remarked along the road from Ilaun to Feuillet a very ancient bridge, such as the one we had seen in the village itself, and constructed in like manner over a projecting dike made of solid masonry, consisting of enormous stones and in excellent condition. We endeavored to ascertain the direction taken by the waters, which during the heavy swellings of the Nile exceeded the elevation of this dike, the surface of which was an inclined plane of perfect smoothness, and we found that they discharged themselves into this quagmire. In very remote ages, therefore, it must have had a destination, respecting which we did not exert our powers of conjecture. Chapter 7. The season was advancing. The whole country presented a verdant scenery and afforded relief to our eyes, which had become much affected by the aridity of the desert. We had, for the first time in our lives, passed a winter of intolerable and continued heat. The month of January in Egypt had appeared to us like the month of June in Europe. Our spirits had returned, and the moral character of the soldier was completely restored. General Bonaparte had ordered General Dessay to withdraw from Fayoum and to move his division to Ben Souf on the left bank of the Nile at 25 leagues from Cairo. After accomplishing this movement, General Dessay proceeded to Cairo on a visit to General Bonaparte. I accompanied him in the excursion, which lasted only a few days and was performed on the Nile. General Bonaparte had not yet received any intelligence from France. His mind was wholly engaged in the formation of every kind of establishment. His constitution was not in the least affected by the climate, and he never fell into a state of drowsiness towards evening, as was the case with everyone else. He was always dressed the same as in Paris, with his coat close buttoned, and yet he seldom perspired. whilst we were all in such high perspiration that the dye ran from our clothes. None but those who have experienced it can imagine the effect produced by such excessive heat. General Bonaparte, after retaining General Desaix with him for a few days and showing that officer every mark of friendship, sent him back to Benesouef in a handsome diger, which he had caused to be prepared for his own use. It was called l'Italie, and had a very splendid appearance.